Dog Park.
You want to begin with that?
Yep, absolutely. I think that's a great spot to jump off into.
Okay, because the thing that I would say about the dog park is that it would not have been possible without the support of so many people.
Yeah.
You know, first we had a wonderful team that came together on the board, both in the pre-planning and then when we actually created a board in 2017. And then so many businesses provided pro bono support. And I think of initially Thad Heckman, who drew our concept design,
Yep.
architect, the Arthur Agency, who did our branding, Ann O'Day, who was on our board but did our website and set up our social media and all of that. Asaturian Eaton did engineering, and then their surveyor, Marty Merrill, is on our board, and he did all the surveying and a tremendous amount of the work working with the various contractors who helped us out. Mathis Excavating and E.T. Simons helped with the construction in really important ways. Green Ridge Landscaping is now, they've come in and they're doing a lot of the landscaping, both donating materials and helping install them. Then probably the most important in terms of if you go out there and you see the shelter, that was built by the John A. Logan Highway Construction Career Training Program. And they built the sidewalk and they built that structure. And they were stopped for a year and a half because of COVID, but they came through. And so that was really wonderful. And then the Plumber's Apprentice Program is putting in this week, tomorrow, we hope, if the weather permits, they will be installing the water fountains, which we've had for a while. Then the city of Carbondale put in the water lines, and the Carbondale Park District has come in since we got it built, and they're doing a lot of help with the labor on the grounds, and they just filled in some of the low spots and seeded it and so forth. But all of the cash outlay, everything that we needed money for, was donated by people in the community or by businesses in the community. And there were a number. There was Egyptian Board of Realtors, Carbondale and Murfreesboro Walmarts, Banterra Bank, the Neighborhood Co-op Wooden Nickel Program.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. and then, of course, we got that $25,000 Pet Safe grant. And that would not have been possible without this outpouring of support from the community. And there were people like you who really got, promoted it and said, vote every day. And, the Arbor District, we've sent out mailings constantly saying be sure to vote. And Quattro's, they have a huge list and they reminded people to vote. And, but it was like people were just saying vote, 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 vote. And we got it.
Yeah.
And that was, to me, that was the most gratifying thing that I felt was, I knew people wanted a dog park.
Yeah.
But the enthusiasm that got behind it and the commitment people had, and, they'll come up to me and say, oh, I voted every day, or I forgot a few days, but I voted. And they feel an ownership in it, because of that. And so it's just been, I'll tell you, it's been the most gratifying project I've ever participated in and helped to create. And, who would think a dog park?
Of all things.
But I knew we needed it.
Yeah.
And we didn't have it, and I knew the students would really value it because they would say when I was campaigning for city council, I'd go around and knock on students' doors, and they'd say, there's no dog park here.
Yeah.
How can you not have a dog park?
Well, and really the pet ownership, activity has really taken off just in the past 5 to 10 years.
Right.
And, it used to be, you had a dog, you had a cat, but now it's like, this is really part of people's lives. They're not just a pet or an animal. It is so much more to people.
That's right. And the other thing, when I was campaigning, And I said, and there was this joke, there are probably more dogs in Carbondale than there are people. Because every time you come to a door, 2 or 3 dogs are at the door trying to greet you and consternating the owner because you want to talk to them, to the, to the grown-up, not to the dogs.
the human, all of a sudden, you mean my little paws, no?
Right.
So this gets us to what's happening. You got the grand opening.
That's right. We had our soft opening as soon as we got the fence up and the gates in. And, the shelter was up because we couldn't put the fence in till the shelter was built. But we said, we have to let people use it.
Yeah.
But it was muddy and, there was a lot of stuff we still needed to do. So, and we wanted to get a feel for what was needed and where to put things. And so we called it a soft opening. And we didn't tell very many people. But boy, has it been used.
Yeah.
So now we're having our big grand opening. We have trees planted in the front. We'll have the water fountains in, weather permitting. There's a lot more that we want to do, that we plan to do, and I can talk about that. But it will be at the point where, especially with the water fountains in, and the weather getting warm and the ground being a little firmer than it was during the winter, where it really will be a wonderful park, and for people to come and not worry about their dogs turning into a mud ball.
You come with fluff, you leave with mud.
That's right. That's right. And so, so there are those kind of issues. It is a floodplain, and so we just, we're going to have to address that down the road, and we've been thinking about it. But yeah, it's the grand opening when we will celebrate what we have done and have a little festival. It starts at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, this coming Saturday, the 21st, and it goes till 1. We'll have our ribbon cutting at 9:15, and then we'll have a contest. Let me see. I don't have the schedule with me, but we're going to have a costume contest, I believe is at 10, and there's the cutest and I forget what all the costumes, and then the human and dog.
Oh, like the tandem costume.
A tandem costume.
If somebody doesn't show up as like classic Adam West Batman and Robin.
That's right, something like that. And then, so that's at 10 o'clock, and then at 11 o'clock we're going to have the cutest, the tricks. And the cutest, the best, and the most tricks, I think, are the 3 categories there. So if people come in, they can sign up. When they come in, there we'll have signs about where to sign up, and come prepared with your dog on a leash.
On a
please.
leash.
Yes.
But now is the park itself, like, how does that work in terms of, people bring their dogs to the park and what the rules are and how that interaction plays out amongst everybody and their pets in the park?
Okay. The rules are that before you enter the park, it's just like being anywhere. Your dog's supposed to be on a leash.
Yeah.
Then there's what we call a sally port. So you go in one gate, close it, take the leash off, and go in, and then go into either the large dog side or the small dog side, depending on which one you want your dog to go into.
Yeah.
And then, with any luck, you won't have 5 dogs crowding the gate and making it difficult. A considerate dog owner will, when somebody comes to the gate, will call their dog away.
Yeah.
And make sure that the new people can come in and the new dog can come in without being terrified by 5 friendly dogs trying to play with it.
Hello, new friend. Hello.
That's right. So, and then once they're inside, the rules are that the owners are responsible for their dog's behavior, and we hope, and we will have some we'll have some trainings, and we'll have some materials as we move along. that you can see if your dog is maybe playing too rough.
Yeah.
And you're scaring your dog scaring another dog, so that you can understand that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
And go calm your dog or divert it or take it somewhere else. Or if it's getting too if your dog's getting scared and maybe is going to start getting aggressive.
Yeah.
How to read that and to stay on top of that. And so we're trying to do a lot of training as we go forward in those kinds of behaviors, so that for the most part we found the people who come now tend to be very responsible about their dogs.
Yeah.
A lot of them know those cues. They can read their dogs, and they separate them when they need to. But mostly the dogs are out there just flying around, playing, running, dashing about, and somebody brings water, and or people bring their own water now, but we will have water fountains, so they won't have to worry about that.
I love it. It's fun. And I'm not, I say this all the time, I'm not a pet person, but just to think of the enjoyment that people are going to get out of this, it's pretty cool.
It's given me such joy to see. Right from the first, these dogs would come out and they would just barrel from one end to the other. There'd be 3 or 4 of them, and they'd run and they'd play and they'd dash about. And then the people talk, and and it's a very welcoming environment.
Yeah.
People chat with one another, and are friendly, because you have your dogs to talk about. You have something friendly, and that's exactly what we wanted to have happen, was to find ways people can come together across a common interest that breaks down barriers between people.
Yeah. That is the spot on transition point, Jane, to bring us into episode 103 of the WTF Carbondale podcast, where we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, and tie it all back to this little old place we call home, Carbondale, Illinois, where, this is going to be one of those conversations where we just talk about threading community together, because Jane has been one of those people doing that kind of work for quite some time. but it's I will not sit here and try and talk about your dad, because I only know what little bit of passing stuff you have shared with me at different times. But it's almost like your dad, did your family come down here with community in mind? Is that a way to describe it? Or?
Well, my parents were socialists.
Okay.
And so my dad had worked in the labor movement, organizing with Walter Reuther.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had worked both in the national office in Chicago, and then organizing for the Southern Tenant Farmers Union and for the Farmer Labor Party in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And so they had a background. They came out of the New Deal, and the New Deal was really about building community, all kinds of programs that worked to do that, to help the disadvantaged, but not sort of come down and give them things, but to organize them, to empower people. Mm-hmm. And so when my dad got a job down here, opening up the unemployment compensation office, the employment security offices here in Murfreesboro, he came down with that headset.
Yeah.
And then they bought a farm out by Ava, an old worn out farm, 180 acres, because my dad had always wanted to farm.
Yeah.
And he had a romantic idea of farming, but he also worked, he had a work ethic that just didn't stop, I'll tell you. So, and it was at the point when farming was consolidating. Mm-hmm. He entered at exactly the wrong time.
Yeah.
If he'd done it in the 20s, it would have been different. But in the early 1940s was not a good time to be trying to be a small farmer. So, but he got very involved with the Extension Service, which were trying to heal the land. It had been deeply eroded. Mm-hmm. And so our farm was an experiment farm, putting in grass waterways and doing other conservation kinds of measures, and also early adopters for things like herbicides, which he later regretted.
Yeah.
But he was, and he raised sheep, and I always had a lamb every year. I raised an orphan lamb. His mother had died, and so I would raise that, and then I would get half the proceeds from the sale of it, and that would go into savings. So I learned how to save from an early age. So that was, and then he worked on the consolidation of the schools, and he helped to start the Jackson County Health Department.
Wow.
And then later, when he helped organize the NAACP in Murfreesboro, because they had always been, that was a core part of what they were about, was racial equality. And somebody in the adjoining office tried to get him investigated during the McCarthy period because he said that when you send people out for jobs, the way the employment was that black people would be sent out as janitors. So they would do the lowest, most menial jobs. Like if Brown Shoe, which was the big employer in Murfreesboro at the time, they worked at the, doing janitorial work basically. And white people would go to the other factory jobs on the line and so forth. None of them paid very well, but
there was a class structure.
There was a real structure
in what job was assigned.
And Dad said, "No, you can't do that. If there's a job opening that somebody's qualified for, you have to send it to them regardless of race." And they had a big go-round about it. And this guy was convinced he was a communist because he was saying you can't segregate, you can't discriminate in hiring. Well, people in Chicago knew him and knew who he was, so it didn't go anywhere. But that was always sort of a point of pride, I guess. And an indication of the time.
Yeah.
Of the kinds of the nature of segregation in the 1950s was that if you opposed it, somebody was going to call you a communist. That was, there were big signs in the late 50s, early 60s of Martin Luther King in a communist training school. And big billboards you would see. And it was a place called Highlander Center, which was a wonderful center. They were not communists. I don't like communists. I know, I've known it. I don't like it. But
that was the boogeyman at the time.
That was the boogeyman.
Because the Soviet Union was communism, therefore communism scary.
Right. That's right. And China, the Chinese Revolution, but anything that changed the hierarchy of power could be branded communist. And so so the fact that and you had to sign a my dad ended up signing the loyalty oath after much searching of his conscience.
Oh my gosh.
Which finally got overthrown by the Supreme Court, but it took a long time because I had to sign a loyalty oath when I was working as student work for 25 cents an hour at SIU in the cafeteria, because I had to sign a loyalty oath.
So what was your educational process like? Are you Dr. Jane Addams?
Yes.
Okay. So
Jane Addams, PhD.
Sorry,
yes.
Jane Addams, PhD. My apologies.
No, that's okay. I'm not a medical doctor, but I am a doctor.
How much of your journey between both your role as a student and your role as an educator was SIU? Was there some in and out? I'm a student here, and then I was a student elsewhere, and I taught here, and I taught there, and what was that?
Okay, well, I went to University High School.
Okay.
And and that was wonderful because because my folks were sort of intellectuals and read, and it was a little different in our neighborhood. But at the university school, there were a lot of other kids who were a lot more like me. And so I loved that. And then I went to Antioch College for a couple, 3 years, and which was a very progressive school, I think. And it was a bit there were a lot of New Yorkers, and I really went through culture shock.
Yeah.
And
being the Southern
being a country
Illinois
girl,
yeah.
being a hick,
Yeah.
And so I ended up coming back here to SIU in 1964, in January of 64, I guess it was. And that's when the civil rights movement was really heating up. And when I was in high school, public accommodations, the restaurants were segregated in Carbondale.
Yeah.
And so there was a biracial group from mostly Unitarians and people from the AME Church, Arch Mosley, and others. I don't really know who all was involved at the time because I was in high school. But they got together and they decided to integrate the restaurants because the Supreme Court had struck down the segregation in public accommodations. And so, and I think the law had passed. I don't remember the exact years, but anyway, so all the restaurateurs said, well, I'm certainly willing to serve anybody, but if I serve black people, they said Negroes at the time, if I serve Negroes, I'll lose my white business. And everybody said that. All of the restaurateurs in town said that. And so they got everybody to pledge, okay, we'll all serve everybody.
All at once.
Yeah. And so then there was a testing program. And so a black couple would go in to a restaurant, and then a few minutes later a white couple would go in. And we'd see, did it actually work? And I was part of that, the white couple who would go in. And everybody got served. And because there was no big battle about it, nobody knew that it had happened. And I was, youth school was racially integrated at the time. And it was the only school, I guess Cobden was, because they had too few black students to keep the school going, so they integrated. But Carbondale was segregated. And so youth school was integrated. And I had black friends. And I remember I was going down the street after school one day with a friend. And I said, a black friend, and I said, let's go in the Hub Cafe, which is where Thai Taste is now. And she wouldn't go in. And when I thought about it, I talked to my mother about it because it really bothered me. And her father was a janitor, which in the black community at that time was a middle-class job. That's how, that's the nature of segregation. But he worked for a private company. And I suspect that she was afraid if she went in to a white restaurant that he might lose his job.
Yeah.
And if he had worked at the university,
that threat would not have existed.
I don't think that threat would have existed. But Southern Illinois was completely segregated, and black families who had real ambitions for their kids, many of them sent their kids to youth school, and they ended up doing very well for the most part. But so it was. Where was I going?
That's the beauty of this conversation, Jane.
I go off
but these are the things, right? When that are that set the stage for the reality that we exist in now.
Yeah.
Right? That issues of racial strife look different than they did 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they sure haven't gone away.
No, but they're really different.
Very different.
Very, very different. And it actually, it makes me very sad because one of the things that integration was what we talked about then.
Mm-hmm.
But the abolition, we didn't really talk about it as the abolition of white supremacy.
Yeah.
But that was entailed in it. That was implicit.
Yeah.
And the promise of that movement has not been fulfilled. It has for the people I went to school with,
Mm-hmm.
for the black middle class. It really did, it just opened doors. It lifted that lid.
On an individual basis, but not necessarily on a systemic basis.
In a systemic basis on many ways,
Mm-hmm.
because in the 50s, the country was a white country.
Mm-hmm.
You looked at TV, Amos and Andy was the black show, right? No whites on that show.
Well, and one thing to touch on before we go this direction, your background is you're an anthropologist, so these are
Right.
things that like you think about and understand at length because this is your school of thought.
Yeah.
All right, so I just had to touch on that as we get
Yes,
deeper
because
into this.
Yeah, because I did go on to eventually get my PhD, finish up my bachelor's here. Well, I went south in 1964
Mm-hmm.
in the freedom movement, and was down there basically for a year and a half until it became clear that to me anyway that the fight had to be carried on by black people.
Yeah.
That I couldn't overcome being white in that environment after all those decades of terror. You know, I was still white. And so I came north and worked in the anti-war movement, basically, and doing some community organizing. But and then eventually got my PhD at University of Illinois, and
Oh, cool.
the rest is history. Ended up here teaching, studying farm life in Southern Illinois. But
which I will just touch on briefly as we cycle back in here, and again, nature of the podcast will bounce all over the place. But I loved it when on the one episode that is inaudible, there was a data loss on that particular podcast that I did with Amelia Blakely, but she talked about the book that you wrote, or one of the books that you wrote. I don't know how many books you have wrote, Jane. In fact, have you just wrote the one book, or have you wrote multiple books?
that was my only sole authored book. I edited the memoirs of a woman who grew up in Wolf Lake.
Okay.
So that was a real. I worked harder on that than I did on my own book, actually.
Because you don't want to take somebody else's words and.
And then I've edited a volume, and I'm working on another one, but it's been a long project. So
It takes time, but but Amelia had just talked about like how much of an impact that book had on her and her mindset. And I mean, now she does, she explores, elements like what Southern Illinois' position is in the Great Migration. Right, and black families who have established themselves in Southern Illinois for, a multitude of generations, and what that work and has looked like, and just stories that are important to who all of us are, and how this one story of many in Southern Illinois reflects on the American story as a whole. So. Even if it was just that one young woman in Amelia Blakely that you have had a great impact on with your book, it has found its place in somebody's mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
So no, and it was so funny, just when we were on the podcast and she was talking and she was, oh my gosh, yeah, Jane has. I was like, here's Jane's number. Like, you got to call Jane. So after this podcast, I'm going to send it to her and be like, Amelia, still got to make sure you're calling Jane. But you'd also, again, we'll bounce all over the place. You made a little bit of a mention of your mother previously. And I know one of the big things that we've talked about on a handful of occasions is your mother working to, as part of the start for the Women's Center. But what other projects, I mean, obviously the Women's Center is a big project. Was that like the thing, or was that just one of many things that your mother did in her life that were, about taking care of others?
Well, when she was young, she worked, as I said, she'd done work with her husband on her then husband, who died when my brother was 7 months old.
Oh, wow.
But they were organizing for the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in the Delta of Arkansas, and so she was involved with a lot of different things then. And in Boston, there was a big birth control movement because at that time in Massachusetts, her husband was at Harvard, I guess it was, or either MIT, doing doctoral work. I think it was. Anyway, but there were demonstrations there, and she worked in the office for birth control. And she talked about where there would be a rumor there was going to be a bust. And so all the grand dames would come down and they would get arrested. And the people like her, who were the office staff, they wouldn't get arrested. It was always the people with big names who would get arrested and put themselves up. It was a way of publicizing the movement. It was a political kind of action. And so that, because it was illegal in Massachusetts for a woman to use birth control, for anybody to sell it. And then she worked for the Spanish Civil War Committee, which was for the medical committee that would do medical vetting of people who were wanting to volunteer to go fight Franco, to fight the fascists in Spain. And she realized, this is a little story about why I don't particularly like communists. There were big struggles. The thing that defeated the Spanish Civil War were the fratricidal battles on the left. And in Cambridge, and probably in the United States, the control of the Spanish Civil War Committee was the communists. They were able to maneuver themselves, and they controlled the medical committee. So if you didn't get vetted as healthy and pass your medical exam, you couldn't go. So you had to be either a member of the CP or a fellow traveler. And if you were a socialist or an anarchist or, whatever, they wouldn't send you over to fight. And she was going to blow the whistle on them, and so she got kicked out of the committee because it was United Front kind of thing. I learned a lot about internecine politics from the stories that she told of those sorts of things. So, because as they say, politics is and sausage are things you don't want to see how they get made. So she had been active in all these things, came down here, got involved with 4-H and home extension and, those sorts of things, but not particularly politically. There wasn't anything that she could find.
Yeah.
But then, and then the civil rights here in Carbondale, and then the anti-war movement and helping people, young men, stay out of the draft because there was a big movement to do that. And so there was a lot of organizing here in Carbondale.
Yeah.
around both civil rights and sending stuff south and rallying support for especially Freedom Summer, but before that as well. And desegregating Carbondale, of course. And then there was the anti-war work, and she was very involved in that as well. And then, but the women's movement, as it came along, a group of women, of which my mother was one, and I guess she would have been in her 40s at that point, I guess. She was probably one of the older women, but she and a few of her good friends, and then a bunch of younger women, all got together, and they decided they needed a center, and it was going to be a center for organizing women. And Pat Benziger, whose husband was a professor at SIU, was part of that group, and she contributed her house, which was on Walnut Street, I think, or Main, I forget which, but anyway, in the old part of town. And so that was the Women's Center, and it was a place where women could get together and talk and organize and so forth. And the police started bringing them people who were battered women who needed a place to stay, needed a safe house. And so one thing led to another, and their house had become a shelter.
Yeah.
Sort of just, because that's what happened, not because they planned it. So then they kind of had to plan it. And then Guy Renzaglia, who started Alto Vineyards.
Yeah.
Okay. Guy and who started the Rehab Institute here on campus. A real visionary. I mean, what a man. He was retiring and moving out to Alto to start his retirement dream of having a vineyard and a winery. And his house, which was on Freeman Street, he gave to this group of women for the rest of the mortgage, whatever was left on the mortgage.
Yeah.
And it was a big house because he'd had a lot of kids, and so they had a lot of bedrooms and a couple 3 bathrooms or something. And so that became the Women's Center. And that was the Women's Center for decades.
Yeah.
Until they built the new one that's on, I forget what that street's called now, but Thompson maybe.
Yeah. Yep. That sounds
Okay.
right.
But just practically, basically around the corner.
Yeah.
And so my dad did a lot of the maintenance work there, and they were real stalwarts. And then it was the first women's center in the country. There may have been one in Austin, Texas, that started at the same time, but they were independent inventions.
Yeah.
It was like great minds think alike.
There just seems to be a lot of connections between Carbondale and Austin, and things happening independently but simultaneously of one another.
I just wish we had kept on the same track
Right.
that Austin did. Talk about internecine politics, but anyway, so they were, and when I would come back home, I did they would have people stay for rape, if a rape victim needed to come in for rape counseling, and somebody would sleep there at the Women's Center, and so I did that when I would come home. I pretty regularly
stay and
gosh,
I mean, these are just, it's amazing just the amount of character that you can develop through just living life at the service of those around you.
Well, I think that's what, one of the things, this is sort of a philosophical thing, but, we live in a society that, and a tradition out of the Enlightenment that starts with the individual and says that relationships between individuals are transactional. And I mean, in its historical context, those ideas were really important because the individual, in terms of as a political person, had been totally obliterated, just didn't exist in the autocratic kinds of polities of the divine right of kings and all of that, and the rigid hierarchies, feudalism, but the importance of the individual, was critical, and philosophizing about that, making that the individual the foundation. But when I look at what gives people meaning, what makes life worthwhile, it's the fact that we are, in our biology, social animals. And I come to that through anthropology, actually, and looking at social animals, and we can't live without other people, and that's on a simply getting food, but on a more profound level, on what binds us together and creates these relationships that we have. And, marrying that community that we have to be part of and that we have to live inside of. We can't live outside of it. I mean, we die if we aren't inside community. With the autonomy and freedom of the individual is a really difficult thing to figure out how to do it. And the Western democracies have struggled with that, I think, the most fully, and not necessarily with the, we have really these huge differences of wealth. We have the disempowerment of large numbers of people, the erosion. We have all kinds of ways that we fail to build community, but that's, to me, that's the core. And churches carry that forward. That becomes, but if you are not of a particular faith, it also separates people. Religion also separates people, and so I think the thing that I inherited from my parents and that I have worked on my entire life in trying to understand and to enact is how to create communities where people can approach each other as full human beings and respect each other and seek to find ways to liberate ourselves as people in community. And, the dog park is a very small way of trying to do that.
That's it, Jade. You get it. You knew exactly where the transition was on that. It was beautiful.
Well,
it's amazing, but something as simple and as I'll just stick with the word simple, as a dog park may represent so much more conceptually, philosophically,
yes,
than the bit of land that it occupies.
Yes. And, it's I talk on, we have a list of old SDS, Students for Democratic Society folks, and I talked about my political action now being hyper-local. And it's really trying to break through. I mean, we're an enormously diverse community here. We have just about every major religion in the world has a congregation here. I mean, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
And we have people of all races and nationalities here, many of whom are permanent residents.
Yeah.
Some of whom are transient, as students, and so forth, but many of whom are citizens, permanent residents, people getting their citizenship. And we have very, very few arenas where we can imagine the future together.
As a global society, like is that kind of what you're not just imagine it as individual pods throughout existence all over, but really what an interconnected, earthbound humanity looks like.
That's right. And here we are in one of the most beautiful places in the world, and one of the, in fact, refuge zones from climate change in many ways.
We go. You got it. I mean, yeah.
And, you've talked about climate refugees coming here. And, there's no place that has more potential than this place to really blossom. And because we have this enormous richness of cultural diversity, and yet we fail to be able to come together and at a level of leadership, because it requires leadership. People just don't do that spontaneously. It takes real leadership. In the 60s with the civil rights movement, the freedom movement, and the anti-war movement, the clergy were very important. They were critical. Mm-hmm. When I was organizing for SDS in the Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, trying to create a network there of people who were engaged with these kinds of issues. Most importantly, the war, but with that came in train all these other things. Everything was inside of that. And I would go to the local Student Christian Foundation or whatever that place, and that's where I would find the people who were in motion, and I would find the leadership that was in motion. That's not true now. And I don't know, there isn't that kind of yeastiness that's happening. Instead, we're getting more and more divided. And not that the divisions weren't profound then. I mean, they were really profound then.
And I think it's to be said, there is a difference between being divided and being in a silo. Right? The difference between, you may be apart on something, but you may have to still be interconnected with somebody, whereas you may be now very much the same as many others around you, but you may not be in any way, shape, or form connected.
Yes.
And that ties back into the issue of community.
Right.
What was it like instilling some of this mindset in students, well beyond a textbook, well beyond just philosophical words on a chalkboard or on a page, but like really getting young people at a pivotal point in their lives to like understand, what it was to suffice in society and community at their age and moving forward.
That's I'm not sure I did that in my teaching.
Fair.
Although I always said that to my mind, democracy was the most important. I mean, I would try to do group projects, and I eventually gave up because it got harder and harder and harder to do group projects. And because of that atomization that really became more and more pervasive. But I think that so I don't really know how to answer.
No, that's
how to
okay.
respond to that.
No, and I there are times in these conversations where I make broad assumptions trying to drive a conversation in a particular direction, and it may just not be that case, right? That there may just be that technical difference between what could be translated and taught in a classroom and what you just had to get out and do in the real world in order to have that impact and share the knowledge and the mindset that you had along with the actions to people that
Right.
may never have set a foot inside your classroom, but they have taken a lot of lessons from you.
Well, I do think that the concept, I mean, anthropology, I'm a social anthropologist, and, our core foundation is cultural diversity. And the thing that I knew particularly coming out of the civil rights movement, was that integration had been seen in many ways as assimilating, and all the immigrants who had come into this country. We are a nation of immigrants.
Yeah.
We truly are a nation of immigrants. But the educational system and the laws and everything were predicated on everybody assimilating to an American norm. And after the Civil War, that American norm was basically a New England ethos, with some elements of, that's a whole other discussion. But anyway, but basically it was when you talk about WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, what you're thinking of is New England. It might be Virginia, but probably not.
Yeah.
If you're in the South, it's Virginia, But, and so everybody becomes that. And I rejected that. I saw living in a black community in the South, on the black side of the color line. I saw the richness of people's lives and the fact that even down here, you speak with a Southern Illinois accent, and people look down their nose at you. You're a hillbilly or a redneck or something. Used to be a hillbilly, and so you have to shed your accent. You have to shed your. You have to adopt all these things as an adult that, and I just didn't think that was right, and so the struggle to create a polity, a society, in which cultural diversity can flourish, which is a problem because you have to have punctuality, you have to have certain kinds of, I expect students to come to class on time, and to follow the rules that I set,
Students don't want to do that.
And
I remember being in college. I didn't want to show up on time.
That's
or
right.
Keep my head up off of a desk. Anywho,
that's right. So, and it's on that micro level where the rubber really hits the road on these issues of navigating diversity and respecting people who are different from oneself. And so the concepts within anthropology, particularly being culture-bound, has been, to my mind, the most important. Everybody's culture-bound. I walk through the world with a certain set of assumptions of what makes me a good person.
Yeah.
And what I can do to be valued and what I can do to be bad. And, I just have a whole set of stuff. Well, somebody from somewhere else has a very different set of assumptions. There's certain basic things you shouldn't steal from people. There's certain bottom lines. But on all the micro levels, they're really different. And, and they cause enormous problems between people in relationships, in families, in, people from different cultural backgrounds, and there's a whole lot of study that's been done. So I would teach that kind of thing. And how do we come to address those things? And, when I hear all these discussions of that's going on now under the wokeness kind of thing, I think, the problem is that we're all culture bound.
Yeah.
And if we understood that, Black people are culture bound, white people are culture bound, white people from the South, North, East, West, Northern Black, Southern Black, urban, rural, there are all these different ways, not even going across to people who come from other countries, that we have assumptions about how one should behave, how you show gratitude, how you recognize another person, how you should speak, whether you should interrupt people or not interrupt people. I mean, there's just it's just a whole set of things that you just think are natural, because we all have our cultural blinders on. And just realizing that on a fundamental level frees you to when somebody acts in a certain way, to say, maybe they aren't being rude. Maybe they aren't dissing me. Maybe they're doing something else. And maybe I should try to find out if it is something else. I mean, maybe they are dissing me.
Yeah.
But that might not be what's happening at all.
Yeah.
And, that kind of questioning that can allow us to transcend those without demanding everybody conform to a certain narrow set of behaviors.
I like that concept, because one thing that I hadn't thought about or don't regularly think about is we're constantly questioning what's outside of our periphery, what's in front of us, but we're not always questioning internally, right? We're questioning externally, not internally, right? And that part of this the woke concept is that it's constantly questioning externally, right? Never questioning internally. And yes, there are a lot of external issues to be dealt with, but like what internally are we all dealing with, and how do we navigate that on a day-to-day interactive individual within the system type of way.
Yeah.
This has just been, I'm so glad that this is the conversation that we had and that we are having, Jane. I mean, it really is enthralling, and how interesting it is to tie all of these activities, of you, of family, of things just into something, again, as simple as the dog park, right? And how it comes together, and you go into things like, you're discussing things to look for in your pet, things to understand about their interactions with others, but these are things that we're just as apt to look inside with ourselves, and what is our interaction like with the others around us, the people in life that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, and what one set of words might mean as those words scale up and reach more and more people around us, and it's a great of great interest, all of this ground that we've covered. I really enjoyed it. The tying back to just standards, just a basic unit of community. How long have you been in the Arbor District for now?
Okay, we moved into town. Dee and I got together in 1996.
God bless you.
And and that's when we moved into town.
How'd you guys meet?
Well, we met in 1964 when I went south I was in training for Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and he was a trainer because he was SNCC staff. And he was the only white Mississippian to be on SNCC staff. He wasn't the only white Southerner. There was some others, but he was the only white Mississippian. And so he was a trainer in nonviolent resistance, and so we were acquainted. And then when I went up in 1965, when I went up to Chicago and went to the SDS National Office, Students for Democratic Society National Office, which at the time was on 63rd Street, which is in the heart of the black ghetto in Chicago. And white people could live there then. He was there and helped to, I was wanting to do campus traveling, and get out and try to organize, because that was my whole, that's what SNCC talked about, was organizing. And I really was imbued with that view of, to organize. And so he'd been out in Iowa, and he knew people at University of Iowa in Des Moines. And so he put me together, he and a couple of the other people in the national office put me together with them. And then he went on to LA, and, I basically didn't really remember him, but, we were acquainted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our paths crossed. And then at a couple of reunions, he was at those reunions with his then wife. And, so we were acquainted. And then a mutual friend, SDSer, put us together after he divorced. So that the rest was history.
And you've been stuck with him ever since.
That's
God
right.
bless your soul. Jane Addams, God bless your soul. What has it been like, just kind of, because the 1996 would have been just a little bit after when property in this town really started to change, like who owned what, how it was owned, transitions from owner-occupied housing to rental housing.
Was well underway.
Okay, yeah. By the time 96 rolled around,
our house that we bought on West Cherry Street, 702 West Cherry Street. I was looking for a place on Elm Street because Hugh Muldoon would have these big parties, and there were picnics, and Elm Street, to my mind, was the street to be on. And so, because there was that community ethos, and there wasn't any house that was appropriate for sale.
Yeah.
But just behind it, on Cherry, this house came available, and the woman who was helping us, the realtor, it was just about to go to a landlord. I don't know who, but somebody. And she told us, she put her hand on the woman's, the other realtor, and said, no, I have somebody for this. And so she told us about it, and we got Gail White. We were down in Mississippi at the time, but Gail White to go look at it, the architect.
Yep.
And so he checked it out for us. And because I'd done a lot of work with him on historic preservation kinds of things. And he said it looked good, looked solid. And so we bought it. And then we put a lot of money into it.
I've got to say, I'm very impressed with the dedication that both you and Dee have to the work that you put into property that you both take on. It really is. It is something to admire. I'm not a house like capable person. Like I can't put hands on things. I can do mechanic stuff, cars, motorcycles, what have you. I'm okay. But when it comes to paint, primer, wood, nails, and the like,
well, we hired a lot of that. We hired a lot of that. But it was, when we bought that house, the people behind us on Elm Street just said, Jane, thank God. Because if it had gone, everybody, there were elderly people on down the street, and that whole block would have gone.
Yeah.
But as it was, we bought the house next door when Randy Nelson, who was blinded in World War II, and political science professor, ombudsman, and when he died, we bought that house, and my parents moved in there. And then when Helen Westberg, who was the only woman mayor of Carbondale, she lived in the next house. And when she moved into assisted living, her husband had died a few years before. When she moved into assisted living, then we bought that house. And we rented it for a while. We renovated them, each one we would renovate. And then one of my colleagues in the anthropology department bought that one. And so those three stayed solid as a rock, and it saved the street. It really saved the street. And then we ended up buying the one on the other side after we'd moved over to Elm Street.
That corner house of Kyle and Otis, is that the...
Oh, no, we had bought that one much earlier.
Oh, okay, different.
And that's where actually my colleague who bought Helen Westberg's house, they'd lived there when they first came into town, when they first got the job.
Well, I've got to say, I love and appreciate the model of what you worked through with them on, going from, treating them well as tenants to working with them to get them in a position to be able to purchase that house and take it from a rental property to an owner occupied is the model for a way to, if we can replicate this hundreds of times over, save the damn town.
Well, that was our idea.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't want to be landlords.
Yeah. You wanted to flip some houses, but not necessarily hold on to.
We would, yeah.
Yeah.
And our vision was that we would fix them up, and then the tenants would buy them.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we for two of them that we did that. I mean, one moved from one house to another house, bought the other house, and then Kyle and his crew. We were so glad they could buy that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it took them a long time of studying, and earning themselves, and getting into all the right working positions. But that's what happens when you go from a starving student to a working professional.
That's right. That's right. And we would love, to be able to. We've offered the houses to our other properties to the tenants who are long-term tenants.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we'll be able to do the same thing. We sort of missed that window of real low.
Oh my gosh!
Interest rates.
I lucked out and I refinanced right at that, and I was just like, it'll never happen again in my lifetime.
Not that low.
No way.
Not that low.
Just to end on while we're on the housing stuff, you've done the garden at your house is just absolutely lovely.
Thank you.
Is building that backyard into what it is now, does that come from a sort of carnal connection to the life of your youth and your mother and father and growing up on the farm and just having like a little plot of land that you still oversee, even if it's not necessarily for any sort of sustenance, but just for beauty and having something there that you that you keep your hands in the earth with?
I don't know. My mother loved gardening. She had flowers, and not a big flower garden, and then we had a big garden that that she canned out of that lasted for the year. But I never did much work in the garden. It was not something I liked doing as a child. I knew I didn't want to farm.
Yeah. Again, the better part of me making these assumptive questions and then watching people go, that's not how that is at all.
But then I always, as an adult, when I lived in Berkeley, I always did some gardening and flowers, and of course, in Berkeley, you stick something in the ground and it grows. Not tomatoes, but the kinds of flowers, pelargoniums and things, because of the climate. and I did quite a bit at the farm. I mean, out at Union Hill when I lived out there. Although Dad really was the gardener there.
Which you said your parents were the second or third house out in the Union Hill subdivision?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And just thinking about as big as it is now, and to be the Anywho, sorry.
But this place, I mean, and so I liked gardening and a little bit, but the gardens that when I saw that house when the Kimmels showed it to us, all those bricks from Walnut Street, the patios, and his wife's, Mary Alice's grandparents she was a real gardener. She was one of, I think, the founders of the garden club. Lucy so she had built the gardens. And then those were sort of maintained. So there were gardens overgrown, neglected, but the bones were there.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dee has an eye for sort of the structures.
Mm-hmm.
So he took out a lot of stuff and he put in stuff, and I really love gardening, and I love having the time to do it.
Well, I mean,
And,
it really is just a little ecological oasis right there.
Yeah, and I'm always learning, and I'm always, it's always changing. I'm always watching, and I never had time before I retired. I mean, I did some. I always did some, but it wasn't. You just don't have time when you're
Working
professoring.
all of the time.
Yeah,
Right?
it's
And
60-hour-a-week job.
things.
Yeah.
Well, Jane, I just, again, I have really enjoyed this, and I'm glad that this is a conversation that's now just solidified for all sorts of people to watch and enjoy, because I think it's just going to hopefully spur some ideas with people and just get them thinking about where we've come from and where we're going, and how little old things like a dog park can just bring it all together.
Right.
Oh,
well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
And I hope that you've had fun as the audience out there for episode 103 of the WTF Carbondale podcast with an absolutely wonderful guest, Jane Adams. Have a good one, folks. Whatever that one may be.